There are moments when someone enters your life and without trying awakens a version of you that you didn't know still existed. Not because they were extraordinary, but because something in their presence mirrored a part of you that had been sleeping. You felt more alive, more courageous, more sensual maybe, more like yourself, and less like the self you've been trying to fix. But then they left, and the ache that stayed wasn't really about them. It was about you, the you who painted again, who breathed slower, who heard poems in silence and saw meaning in ordinary things. Carl Jung once said that what we repress eventually returns, often through projection. What if that person wasn't love itself, but a soul mirror, reflecting what your own unconscious was begging you to remember? Joe Dispenza teaches that your nervous system can't distinguish between who you are and who you repeatedly become. So maybe you weren't falling in love. Maybe you were rehearsing your truth in the presence of someone who felt like home. This isn't a story about heartbreak. This is a remembering of the soul you forgot, of the life you didn't know you could live. You weren't in love with them. You were in love with the you that emerged beside them. There are absences that don't echo their name. They echo yours. Because what you miss is not a voice or a body or a gaze, it's the version of yourself that came to life in their presence. Around them, you dared to be more present. You spoke slower. You listened deeper. You danced with a kind of softness that didn't ask for permission. And now that they are gone, it's as if that version of you went with them, as if your own essence was locked away in a memory you can't return to. This is the wound most souls don't know how to name. The grief not of losing a person, but of losing access to the self you became near them. That self was sensual, vivid, emotionally bold in ways your life rarely allowed. Carl Jung would say, "It wasn't them you loved. It was what they reflected back, a repressed essence that found breath again, a soul fragment returned. And yet, when that mirror left, so did the permission, the courage, the temporary feeling of wholeness. You're not crazy for missing what wasn't even yours to keep, because what you lost was never fully external. It was a memory of you made visible by their presence. And now the ache isn't about getting them back. It's about finding a way to let that self live, even without them watching. There are moments when the heart whispers so loudly that it drowns out all reason, and we follow. Not because we are certain, but because something inside aches to believe. Follow your heart, they say, as if the heart were always a sacred compass. But Jung reminds us, what we call the heart may sometimes be a masked longing, a wounded archetype searching for completion, a forgotten child within, dreaming of being seen. You didn't just follow your heart. You followed the fantasy of who you were becoming in their presence, the feeling of possibility, of transformation, of emotional rebirth. But the psyche is subtle. It doesn't only create dreams, it creates myths. And in that myth, they became the promise, the answer, the holy figure in the temple of your imagination. What if it wasn't the truth of love but the beauty of becoming that pulled you so strongly? What if you mistook the rising self for the soul of the other? Joe Dispenza teaches that the brain can fire as vividly in imagination as it does in reality. And maybe, in that vision, your nervous system rehearsed a life that never truly existed, but that felt more real than anything else. This doesn't mean your feeling was false. It means it was symbolic, a mirror not of destiny but of deep desire, to be, to feel, to become. And now the question that lingers is not, was it real, but rather, what part of me did it awaken? Some connections arrive not to stay but to awaken, not to fulfill a promise but to ignite a path. You may have called them your soulmate. But what if they were never meant to complete you, only to reveal you? There are presences that act like sacred mirrors. They reflect a version of you you didn't know you had the right to become. They walk beside you not as destiny but as permission, to grow, to see, to transform. And when they vanish, the grief doesn't say they're gone. It whispers, "I saw myself, and now the mirror is broken." Jung would call this the moment of confrontation with the anima or animus, the inner other that appears outside of us, wearing the face of another. They weren't the one, they were the reflection of the one within. Like Psyche, after losing Eros, your soul stands alone now, but not as it was before. Because even loss carries a flame, even absence teaches presence. Joe Dispenza reminds us that emotional memories can reshape the body, the chemistry, the very field of perception. They were the environment where you tasted your own potential. Now that they're gone, the environment has changed, but the memory remains, not as nostalgia, but as a spiritual invitation to keep becoming, even without their gaze. Love didn't fail. It simply handed you back to yourself. After certain bonds, the world goes quiet. Faces pass, conversations flow, smiles return. But something in the soul refuses to call anything else home. Not because they were perfect, but because your energy calibrated to their presence. Your nervous system learned a rhythm, a tone, a melody that felt like truth. And now everything else feels flat. Not wrong, not empty, just out of tune. Joe Dispenza speaks of emotional addiction, how the body remembers sensations even when the source is gone. Your chemistry isn't yearning for a person. It's yearning for the state of being that once felt alive in their presence. That frequency, the emotional texture of you in their field, became familiar. You weren't just with them, you were yourself with them. Raw, unfiltered, breathing in full color. Now others feel like echoes, like songs in the wrong key, like light that doesn't know how to land on your skin. This is not a sign that love is over. It's a sign that the self you met in that connection is still waiting to be fully integrated, fully inhabited. Jung would say you're caught in a symbolic memory, where the psyche hasn't yet reclaimed the archetype it projected. What you seek isn't outside, it's the resonance you left behind. And maybe the next home isn't someone new, but the you who remembers how to feel alive again, from within. There are people who seem to carry a light that magnetizes us, a voice that feels like poetry, a presence that seems larger than life, but sometimes it isn't them we're drawn to. It's the archetype they awaken. Jung called this projection the psyche's way of externalizing what it cannot yet hold within, the muse, the healer, the rebel, the sacred redeemer. You weren't just seeing a person, you were seeing the soul you had forgotten. Reflected back in their eyes, what felt like enchantment was recognition, not of their truth, but of your own silenced one. They wore the face of your unlived life, the voice of your secret poems, the silence of the self you left behind, and the obsession, that ache that won't let go. It may not be about them at all. It may be your soul mourning the parts of you that were never claimed. Joe Dispenza would say the body responds to emotion like it does to memory, and perhaps your nervous system isn't haunted by a lover, but by an archetype your life didn't yet make room for. This is not romantic longing. This is spiritual displacement. You didn't lose them. You misplaced yourself in their image. And now, the soul is calling not for reunion, but for reintegration. There is a quiet truth that only reveals itself after the storm, that what you miss might not be a person, but a state of being that came alive in their presence. It wasn't their voice that made your heart tremble, but the way your voice softened around them. It wasn't their stories that made you feel seen, but how your own stories suddenly made sense when you told them. You weren't just in love with who they were. You were in love with how you became someone new in their company. Jung would say the self is born in reflection, that we meet ourselves through the gaze of the other. And maybe they weren't the gift, you were, unwrapped only briefly in the mirror of their presence. Joe Dispenza teaches that emotions are the language of the body, and your body remembers how your breath deepened, how your laughter returned, how your defenses fell away like old skin. That version of you was real, alive, essential, but it was never theirs to give. It was always yours. The miracle wasn't them. The miracle was how, for a moment, you stopped hiding from yourself. And now, the grief you carry is not about a broken bond, but about a self left standing at the altar of almost. You were not in love. You were remembering how to be whole. Did you enjoy the content and it made a difference for you? Click on Super Thanks and support our work. There are memories that don't fade because they were never meant to, not as longing but as invitations. The soul doesn't mourn because someone left. It mourns because something remained unfinished. They weren't the destination. They were the doorway, and your grief isn't calling them back. It's asking you to step through what they opened. Jung spoke of individuation as the process of becoming who you truly are. And sometimes that process begins not in silence but in heartbreak, not in wholeness but in fragmentation, because the presence of another can light a fire you didn't know was yours to tend. And when they leave, the flame doesn't die. It waits for you to pick it up, to carry forward what was sparked, even if it burns a little. Joe Dispenza reminds us that energy follows awareness, and maybe now it's not about returning to what was, but about choosing to nurture what began. You weren't meant to go back. You were meant to go inward, to take the courage you found in their eyes and wear it as your own. The soul isn't asking for reunion. It's asking for completion. What remains is not a wound, it is a path. There once was a woman who swore she had found love, not just in the way he touched her hand, but in how she came alive in the silence between them. When he entered the room, she remembered poems from her childhood. She painted again. She laughed in tones she hadn't heard since she was a girl beneath the trees. Everything felt brighter when he was near. Not because he brought the light, but because something in her soul began to open. She believed it was him, that it was his presence, his mystery, his gaze that made the world bloom. And then he left, and she thought she lost everything. The colors, the breath, the voice that used to sing beneath her own skin. But time, like the moon, has a way of revealing what the sun hides. And slowly she began to see. He was not the source. He was the mirror. The season was not him. It was her, and she had mistaken her own spring for his shadow. Jung would say she had touched an inner archetype, projected it outward, loved it in another's name. But now she could call it back, not as grief, but as a returning. Joe Dispenza might call it emotional entrainment, a moment when the body learns a new way of being. But the soul already knew, and it waited patiently for her to remember. He was just the weather. She was the season. You weren't in love with a person. You were remembering yourself. Their presence was not the miracle. The miracle was your own awakening in the space they held, the breath you allowed yourself to take, as if your soul had been waiting for that exact tone, that specific light, to finally return. Carl Jung once wrote, "Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life and you will call it fate." And maybe that's what you called it. Fate, love, destiny. But what it really was the face of a forgotten self. Joe Dispenza teaches you have to become the feeling before the experience. And perhaps you became the feeling in their presence. You embodied a soul state that your life hadn't dared to make permanent. Now, that presence is gone. But the self, she is not. She remains, waiting to be chosen. Not as a fleeting echo, but as a conscious becoming. This was not the end of a love story. It was the beginning of a soul remembering what it came here to be. And if you made it this far, whisper with us in the comments, "Estoy despierta." So the others, those who feel like you but haven't yet found the words, know they are not alone. There is more to remember, and the soul is not done speaking.